This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel.
Welcome back to The Common Denominator. I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. We are here today with Robert Spencer. He's the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's the author of 28 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad. The bestsellers as well, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, and The Critical Quran explained from key Islamic commentaries and contemporary historical research. His forthcoming book is Muhammad, A Critical Biography. Spencer has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, United States Army Command, and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and the U.S. intelligence community. He's discussed jihad, Islam, and terrorism at a workshop sponsored by the U.S. State Department and the German Foreign Ministry. He is a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy. Spencer's a regular columnist for PJ Media and Front Page Magazine and has written many hundreds of articles about jihad and Islamic terrorism. His articles on Islam and other topics have appeared in countless platforms across a vast gamut of media sites and journals. He's also served as a contributing writer to the Investigative Project on Terrorism and as an adjunct fellow with the Free Congress Foundation. Spencer's appeared on a staggering list of news, talk shows, and radio channels from BBC to CNN to The Mark Levin Show. He's been a featured speaker at universities and institutions from Penn State to Westminster Institute. All the above, a far lengthier list than we can name all here. His depth of expertise and quality of research has guided curious audiences across every spectrum of public and private discussion that can be held. The purpose of our conversation is not to aha Islam or cherry pick problematic passages of another faith, nor to call it out as lesser. Jews worldwide see TikTok versions of their own Talmud deliberately maligned daily. Ours is not a conversation removing quotes from its framework, but rather the defining of that framework and context itself. We pursue coherence in this critical period where the issues that directly affect our lives have never been made more distorted and contrite and weaponized to confuse, divide, and conquer us. We know the method well, and we're tired of it, where to look at challenges in the eye and call them aloud by name rains down an ingenuous clutching of pearls and censorship of speech, for it threatens the hypocritical behavior and policy of the absurd that decays the West at this moment. Our world has fundamentally changed. It's vital that we understand what's driving it. It's critical that we absorb not engagement farming headlines, but the more complex and messy roots of the ideologies that drive those changes, precisely as is our aim for the Jewish perspective in Israel. We will arrive at no clarity nor ability to affect it without understanding the motivations of the forces that progress them. We are living in a world where Islamic terrorism threatens 9 million people and the entirety of the state of Israel, but hardly us alone. It threatens the 90 million Iranians who roar out of their chokehold with the death of the butcher of Iran, former President Ebrahim Raisi, this week. And it threatens the free world in its entirety and the civilization on which it was built. That means you and me both. The religious ideology that defines the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, along with their proxies in Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and their many various branches, is foreign to us on an elemental level. In increasing frequency, we witness acts of savagery that we do not wish upon our worst enemy. Acts that go against not only our myriad of cultures, but go against the humanity which we believe to be shared by us all. Robert Spencer, you are most welcomed. Thank you greatly for taking the time to join us today and help us understand what the civilization we so cherish faces so that we might act decisively to keep it alive.
Thank you very much. I'm honored by your invitation.
So let's just start off in brief. Tell us how and why did you get involved in this work? And how have you managed to stay with it for so long? If I'm correct, 1980, you began your research.
Yeah, that's right. I was actually, the roots of it go back farther than that. to the 1960s, because that was when I was very young, and I would hear stories from my grandparents, particularly my grandmother, about life in Çeşme, in what is now Turkey, and at the time she was growing up, the Ottoman Empire. And she would tell us how beautiful it was, how she loved to hear the Islamic call to prayer in the morning. She was not Muslim, but she and Barack Obama are the two people in the world who say that it's the beautiful sound. And she painted life there when she was growing up as an idyllic paradisal thing. So then, of course, that led to my inevitable question as 6 or 7 years old: why did you leave? And she said, we were exiled. Why were you exiled? And that was always the end of the discussion. So I was always curious as to what was the reason that my grandparents left there and came to the United States. And that led me to begin to study the history of the region. And ultimately, it came to me that this was all about Islam. And this was around the time when I was in college in 1980, indeed, and started to read the Quran, because as it turned out, they were given the choice to convert to Islam and stay there where their families had lived from time immemorial, or leave, be exiled. And so they left, and my great-grandfather was murdered on the way out, but the rest of them were able to get out. And it was all about in the first place, the Islamic clerics' idea that the religious minorities in this region were Kufar Harbi, infidels at war with Islam, because they wanted their independent states. You know, the Greeks had independence from 1823, and there were all the Greeks in Western Anatolia who wanted a gnosis union with the Greeks in Greece. And then there were the Armenians in the eastern part of Anatolia, and they wanted their own state. And so they were both rebelling against the lawful Islamic authority, which in Islamic law means they could be killed. And so this is the occasion of the genocide of 2.5 million Armenians and 1 million Greeks and 300,000 Assyrians. And this is, of course, the basis on which the genocides of the 20th century proceed. Because, of course, Haji Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was in the Ottoman military when the genocides were taking place. And then he went to Berlin and lived during World War II, meeting with Hitler, meeting with Himmler, friends with Eichmann, visited a concentration camp. Some people even have asserted that he gave plans for gas chambers that the Turks had developed for the Armenians to the Germans. I don't know the extent of the truth of that, but there's no doubt that al-Husseini, of course, agitated for the end of the emigration of the Jews of Europe and the beginning of their being mass murdered. And this was the occasion for Hitler's statement, well, whoever remembers what happened to the Armenians? Nobody cares. And so, and of course, nobody even mentions that there were Greeks involved as well. Not only does nobody care about that, nobody even knows about it. So anyway, all this led me into trying to understand the theological principles within Islamic tradition that could lead people to behave in this way, because that was the underpinning of all of it. Now, a lot of people will note that the Turkish nationalists continued this and completely eradicated, with the exception of a very tiny minority that remains in Istanbul, completely eradicated the Greek community of what is now Turkey, that had been there since the time of Homer, you know, and the Trojan Wars and all that. The Turkish nationalists, though, had the idea of a Turkish nationalist secular state that included Islam as part of the identity of a Turk, without the political aspects of Islam. And so there was still no room for those who were not Muslim.
Well, so for 35 years and even longer, you're searching for this answer, and it doesn't seem like it's such a, maybe I should say, well, have you arrived at clarification after all of this time?
Yeah, I would say that I have full clarity now as to what happened, that it does have to do with several principles that are rooted in the Islamic religion, that have to do with things that are relevant to the situation of the state of Israel as well, because the welter in Anatolia at the time of the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the time that the Greeks and the Armenians were trying to establish their own independent states also gave rise to groups that asserted that this was Islamic land and consequently it belonged to Islam forever, and that there was no legitimacy to an Armenian state or a Greek state on any of that land because it was Islamic. The idea is based on chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran, which says very simply, drive them out from where they drove you out. Now, if you think about this statement, it's a very brief and simple statement, but it's extraordinary in its implications, because it is saying that if you are on land that the Muslims once occupied, however legitimately or illegitimately, or by whatever means they got it, that's not relevant, then it belongs to them forever, and they have a divine command from the supreme being, the creator of the universe, to drive you out of it and take it back. As Brezhnev said in a very different context in 1968, when the what was it, the Prague Spring was in flower, and a kinder, gentler form of Soviet communism was being exercised in Czechoslovakia, and Brezhnev sent in the tanks, and people were protesting and saying, how can you send tanks against your fellow socialists? And he said, don't talk to me about socialism. What we have, we hold. And that's the same principle in Islam. That's a quintessentially Islamic principle. What we have, we hold. And so the Greeks had to be driven out, and the Armenians had to be driven out of Anatolia, and the Jews have to be driven out of Israel. And the Spanish have to be driven out of Spain. There are plenty of others on the to-do list.
This is amazing because obviously it couldn't be more relevant. And I've actually never heard anyone reference it to the Quran and their actual ideology, because my understanding has been that the Nakba, the tragedy is not so much about the land, it's their inability to defeat the Jews, the weakest of the weak, and that where it's a stain on the existence. It's the fact that it's a stain on their identity, on their religion, on their relationship to Islam. They're not able to defeat us. But
well, it's not just because of weakness. It's because of who the Jews are in the Quran. Chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran says, the most intense in enmity of all people toward you will be the Jews and the polytheists. And so the polytheist part is not relevant here, but if the Jews are the most intense in hostility toward the Muslims, then what that works out to in practice is that the Muslims are the most intense in hostility toward the Jews. And the idea is, see, you also have to understand that within the context of the fact that there is no room in Islam for the idea that the wicked prosper. All through the Hebrew scriptures, you have the psalmist lamenting, why do the wicked prosper? And the idea that defeat and loss are sometimes part of what it means to be God's people. But there is no concept of that in Islam. In Islam, it's a one-to-one equation that Allah will reward you in this world and in the next if you obey him, and Allah will punish you in this world and in the next if you don't obey him. And so, if the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims, then humiliation and disgrace must follow them. And this is another Quranic passage, 3:112. Follow them, 289 and 3:112. Humiliation and disgrace must follow them throughout the world because they are disobeying Allah. And so the idea of the Ummah, the global Islamic community, being defeated by people whose natural position in the world, rightful position in the world, according to the word of the Supreme Being, is to be humiliated and disgraced, and who are the worst enemies of the best of people on earth, which is chapter 3, verse 110 of the Quran, then you see it's just a massive insult. It's a tremendous threat to the religion itself. And this is an aspect of the conflict that the Western world universally ignores because they don't take theology seriously or think it could possibly be relevant for political action.
There's a few things that questions I have from that. So first and foremost, so if you're comparing Jews with those who worship many gods, so is it because they need to delegitimize if they're to be the purveyor of a new revelation? Is that because it shouldn't be at odds in theory, part of the Abrahamic type of religion, one God, the original. So why us?
Chapter 3, verse 67 of the Quran says, the Jews and Christians argue over Abraham, and they are both ignorant. Abraham was neither a Jew nor Christian. He was a Muslim. Now, you might think, how on earth could Abraham be a Muslim when Muhammad is 7th century CE and Abraham is thousands of years before that? And see, this is a very important element of Islamic theology that is virtually completely misunderstood in the West. And when people talk about this, the three great Abrahamic religions business, they do not realize that this is not the same Abraham. He has the name, but Abraham in Islam is an Islamic prophet, and so is Moses, and so is David, and all of the rest of them, and so is Jesus also. And the idea is that they all taught Islam, and then their craven and self-serving and sinful, rebellious followers twisted their teachings to suit their own purposes, and in so doing created Judaism and Christianity as we know them. And so the real Jews are the Muslims. The real Christians are the Muslims. When they say our Allah and your Allah are the same, which is also the Quran, chapter 29, verse 46, they are talking about actually meaning that the Jews and the Christians are renegades who have twisted the teachings of their own prophets to create false religions. And they are the real thing, the correct version of the teachings of Abraham and Moses and all the rest of them. So we're all children of Abraham, except they're the real children of Abraham, and we're the fake ones.
Wow, that's incredible insight. Because of course, spending any time online and watching the inversion of narrative and the unhinged hysteria and all of that, recently someone was posting around a picture of a little basket of Moses, but like wrapped in a keffiyeh, something along those lines, to show that Moses was. And I thought this was just sort of like along the lines of kind of, sticking it to the Jews type of thing. I didn't really think that, I didn't understand there was a real belief behind that. It's very, very telling. It's
of cardinal importance, and it runs all the way through Islam. Islam is about submission. That's what Islam means. People tell you Islam means peace. Salam means peace. Islam is a related word. You know how it works on the three consonants, just like Hebrew. And so salam and Islam share the same consonants, and they are related words, but they're not the same word. And salam is peace, Islam is submission. Now, submission in the classic sense is submission to Allah, that every human being has to submit to Allah. But also there are all kinds of other submissions. And one of them is, I mean, of course, there's women have to submit to men, but also non-Muslims have to submit to the Muslims. And they have to submit to the Muslims because a passage I mentioned earlier, chapter 3, verse 110, the Muslims are the best of people on earth. And the passage goes on to say, you are the best of people enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. So the Muslims know what's right and wrong, and the non-Muslims do not. And so it's the responsibility of the Muslims to teach the non-Muslims what's right and wrong. But this is not a classroom setting or a situation of student and teacher. It's a situation of master and slave, or the one who submits and the one who is the overlord.
Can you say more about this? Because it's very clear living here in the Middle East that it is a rule or be ruled mentality.
Yeah.
Please tell me more about that.
Okay, take for example the Temple Mount. And there are two mosques on the Temple Mount. Why are there two mosques on the Temple Mount? It's not just a coincidence. There are two mosques on the Temple Mount because it's the Temple Mount. Because the idea was, when they were built in the 690s, to assert the defeat of the Jews and the victory of Islam over Judaism. That is a universal practice. I wrote a book in 2018, The History of Jihad. And in it, I've got an extensive history of the jihad against India. And in India, there are literally thousands of Hindu temples that the Muslims destroyed. And then they built a mosque on the site of the temple. And not only that, but they took the idols, the statues of the Hindu gods, and broke them into pieces and strewed the pieces along the pathway to the mosque, so that every time the Muslims went to pray, they'd be trampling on the Hindu gods.
Yeah, we see them doing it. Yeah, excuse me. No, you see that doing it with the Israeli flag on a regular basis.
There you go. And see, the idea is to assert that we are the dominant people. These are the people who should be submitting, and we have victory over them. This is not extremism or some strange eccentric sect of Islam. This is mainstream, basic, fundamental Islam across all the sects and schools of jurisprudence. And it's the same thing with Christianity. One of the foremost mosques in the world is Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which was the foremost cathedral in the Christian world for nearly 1,000 years, from 537 when it was built to 1453 when Constantinople was conquered. And the building was immediately transformed into a mosque in order to show the superiority of Islam over Christianity and the victory of Islam over Christianity. So it works in whatever context. This the same thing, as a matter of fact. I myself became notorious about 15 years ago now, when Pamela Geller and I in New York City led a successful fight to defeat the idea of building a 16-story mega mosque at ground zero on the site of one of the buildings that was destroyed in the 9/11 attacks. And everybody said, oh, this is going to be a mosque of reconciliation and peace, and you're being bigoted and hateful and racist. And the fact of the matter that was completely ignored is that all over the world, there's not a single mosque of reconciliation and peace with unbelievers. That's just not a concept in Islam. There are many very fine people who are Muslims who are all about reconciliation and peace, but I'm talking about Islamic theology here, not about individuals. And there are literally thousands of triumphal mosques that were built either on the site of places of worship of conquered people or in the buildings that were appropriated from conquered people. that were made into mosques in order to show the victory of Islam. And that ground zero mega mosque would have been another. America, not being a religious entity, it wasn't a grand church or something that was destroyed. America being a secular state, but being the economic powerhouse of the world, you destroy the World Trade Center in New York City, the symbol of American economic power, and then you put a mosque there. It's the same principle, the same impulse, showing
Absolutely.
the victory of Islam.
That's incredible. I didn't even know of that. That's really powerful statement. Certainly in Judaism, there's multiple interpretations of any given text. Is there anything like that comparable in Islam, or are there arguments? Is there general agreement? You go to this imam for your one opinion and another for. I mean, how does that work?
Well, there is variance of opinion, and particularly in the West, in the United States, it's easy to find Islamic scholars who say, "Oh, let's all coexist," and so on, and that's great. But the fact is that literalism is mainstream in Islam in a way that it is not now and never has been in either Judaism or Christianity. And the various schools of jurisprudence in Islam that are quite influential in the Islamic world all interpret the passages that I am discussing in generally the way that I discuss. There is no sect of Islam that teaches that Muslims should not wage war against unbelievers in order to establish the global hegemony of Islam. That's a core Islamic doctrine. It's almost completely obscured in the West. There's a great deal of deception about it and a great deal of lying about it. But nonetheless, if you read material that is written by Muslims and for Muslims, it's spoken about quite openly. And this is not to say, of course, that every Muslim believes these things or does these things any more than any average Jew or Christian is going to be completely on board with everything that's written in his or her scriptures. But the theology is there, and thus it is always there to be exploited by those who wish to do so.
So that's really so key. The literalism. So much hope for us here in the region, and really I think everywhere, is this idea of seeing Islam go through a reform, seeing there really be able to, the idea, yes, of the Abraham Accords, of this idea of being able to make agreements and keep them. What's the reality of that? Is it that Islam hasn't gone through its reform yet? Will it? Do you have any realistic hope for that?
Chapter 5, verse 3 of the Quran says, "This day I have perfected your religion for you." That's Allah speaking. Now, if he perfected the religion, then you're going to change it. You're only going to make it worse. If it's perfect now, it doesn't need fixing. So there have been reformers throughout Islamic history. In the book, The History of Jihad, I discuss quite a few of them. But the thing about the reformers in Islam is they're not looking for some new understanding of Islam. That would be bid'ah, innovation, which is a very big sin. You don't innovate because the religion is already perfect. You just enact it as it was handed down to you. And so the reformers, what they are to a man, are people who are trying to restore the original vision of Islam at a time when they contend that it has been corrupted. And the difficulty of that is that the original vision of Islam, going back to the Quran and the traditions about Muhammad, are quite violent and supremacist and aggressive. And so, take, for example, the Abraham Accords that you mentioned. Those are real things. And as long as the Islamic Republic of Iran remains a threat, they will likely remain viable. But they are pragmatic based. They are not based on Islam. As a matter of fact, every one of the countries that entered into those accords is under pressure from Islamic hardliners because of entering into an agreement with the Jews. And if at any point the Islamic Republic were to fall, which is something we can all hope for, the Abraham Accords will also fall. Because if Iran is no longer a threat, then there won't be any more reason for them. Islam is always going to remain, and eventually Islam will destroy the Abraham Accords, one way or the other. Now, I'm not a Muslim, and I'm not saying that Islam is going to prevail ultimately. There are deep divisions within the Islamic world, and there's a massive crisis of apostasy now, because in the modern age, you can't keep the truth about Islam out of the Islamic world. It used to be, you grew up in Riyadh or Kabul, and you would never hear anything but what the imams and mullahs taught you. But now you can go online and read my website or watch YouTube videos of critics of Islam and see that a lot of it doesn't make any sense and is contradictory on its face, and people are reconsidering and are leaving the thing. So I don't mean to, in other words, give no hope whatsoever, but the idea that there's going to be massive reform in Islam is always going to meet with the fact that the reformers have been and will be challenged by people within the Islamic community as being guilty of innovation and thus being heretics who deserve death, rather than reformers who have a new vision who deserve respect. Mahmoud Mohammed Taha was a reformer in Sudan in 1985, and he formulated a vision of Islam that was based on the idea. In the Quran, there are two different kinds of passages. There are Meccan chapters and Medinan chapters, because Muhammad is supposed to have lived in Mecca for the first 12 years of his career as a prophet and then moved to Medina. And he got revelations in both places. The Medinan passages are generally considered to take precedence over the Meccan ones because they follow later. And the idea is that what comes later supersedes what comes earlier. Unfortunately for the rest of the world, the most violent passages are in the Medinan part that comes later. So Mahmoud Mohammed Taha said, why don't we flip this and say the Meccan passages take precedence and formulate a theology of coexistence with the non-Muslims? And he was hanged by the Sudanese government as a heretic in 1985. This is not 100,000, not 1,000 years ago, not even 100 years ago. 1985 is within the lifetime of many of us, and so this is the situation that reformers face, and a lot of people who blithely put their hope in Islamic reform don't really realize what the situation is for reformers in the Islamic world or the nature of Islamic theology.
So you said that you think people are abandoning Islam more and more, but the word on the street was exactly the opposite. I think it on your website that you referenced a 14-year-old girl who was planning a stabbing attack just this week, I believe. What is attracting young people with their whole lives ahead to commit? I mean, and in Europe, I'm not talking about down the road here. It seems from our point of view that people are running to Islam, that they're running to any sort of coherence, sort of that feeling of being part of something. But you're saying that you think people are leaving. I'd love to hear which part you see.
Both things are true at the same time. There are a lot of converts to Islam in the West. I'm not sure. I don't have that story in front of me right now. I don't remember that girl was a convert. The 14-year-old. I
don't know that she converted. You're right. I don't know whether she was a convert, but she was a 14-year-old girl who. It's a good point.
She certainly got the idea, whether she was a convert or not, that it would be a holy act that would be pleasing to Allah and would secure her a place in paradise if she killed infidels. Now that comes from the Quran. The Quran actually it can cause people great mental anguish as all religions can. But chapter 21, verse 47, I'm not saying that's the only thing they do, but anyway, chapter 21, verse 47 of the Quran says that there are grand scales, and Allah will put your good deeds on one scale and your bad deeds on another. And if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. Okay, so very simple idea, but how much does a deed weigh? How much do each of your different deeds weigh? And how many of each do you have? Nobody knows the answers to those questions. And so it can drive you crazy. And you start thinking, okay, how many good deeds do I have? Am I going to hell? Am I out? Have my bad deeds outweighed my good? Nobody knows. And so what can you do? Well, the Quran contains a guarantee of paradise. And that's chapter 9, verse 111. It says that paradise is guaranteed to those who kill and are killed for Allah. If paradise is guaranteed to those who kill and are killed for Allah, then all you have to do is go and kill some infidels. And if you get killed in the process, then you have a place in paradise. There is no doubt about it. And so, excuse me, this 14-year-old girl, she may have been thinking that, because secular people have a great deal of trouble understanding religious ideas. Secular people of whatever tradition. But we have to put this into the context of thinking this is absolutely real. This is not a metaphor. This is not literature. This is not anything but the absolute words of the creator of the universe. And so he's going to torture you forever if you have been bad beyond his standards. And that's very real. In the Quran, the tortures of hell are very lavishly described. He's going to pour molten lead down your throat. He's going to burn your body up. And then when your body is gone, he's going to give you a new one so he can burn that one too. There are all kinds of terrible things that are going to happen to you, and they're never going to stop happening. All you have to do to be free of that and never to worry about that again is kill these terrible people over here, the most vile of created beings, which is what the Quran in chapter 98, verse 6 calls the unbelievers among the people of the book, who are Jews and Christians. All you have to do is kill them, and if they kill you, so much the better. Then you're guaranteed.
So there's been this idea that there's, and I hear what you're saying, and pardon me while I adjust the language, but this idea that there's a Islamism, radical Islam, that there's some percentage of those who adhere to the more savage and barbaric parts that you've described, but you're saying that this is actually really part and parcel to the entire framework of the entire religious. So why are there? So this explains, number one, why so much of the acts of terror that we see by the vast majority are people of Muslims, but there's still a percentage that act on this. So what are we looking at percentage-wise, realistically? There's 2 million Israeli Arabs that live here and live here quite happily, having embraced some other version, at least embrace progress and a good economic life, if nothing else. But what would you say about that? What sort of percentage out of, if we're talking about 2 billion Muslims?
Mm-hmm. Percentages are very tough in this regard, and I'll explain why. You mentioned at the beginning of the question the idea that this was an extremist view, and that a view that was held by only a minority of Muslims. In a certain sense, that's right, but in a certain sense, it's not right. This is a mainstream view in Islamic theology, and is taught by all the major schools of jurisprudence, all the centers of Islamic learning, Al-Azhar in Cairo, all the rest of them, the Deobandis in India. They are going to teach the kind of Islam that I'm talking about. But human nature is everywhere the same. And there are a lot of people among those 1.8 billion or however many Muslims you want to say. There are a lot of people who will hear all this and nod and go home and think, okay, what's for dinner and what's on TV or whatever. And they're never going to kill any infidels. They're really not all that interested in the whole thing. Just as there are Jews and Christians and Hindus and Buddhists who will they'll call themselves that if you ask them, but they're really not interested. And for that, we can all be grateful. But they don't have a theological leg to stand on within Islam. It's not as if the peaceful Muslims who live in Israel and elsewhere have an are from the X sect that teaches peace and love and butterflies and harmony. There is no such sect. They don't have a different view of Islam. They just don't pay attention. They think, that's something for other people to do, which is actually a concept in Islam, that jihad is actually fard kifaya, which is an obligation that is incumbent upon the community as a whole. And if it's discharged by a part of the community, then the rest of the community is exempt from it. However, if a Muslim land is considered to have been attacked, then jihad becomes fard ayn, which is incumbent upon every individual Muslim. And of course, that is the contention of Mahmoud Abbas and all the Palestinian leaders, that an Islamic land has been attacked, this mythical land of Palestine that was supposedly an Arab Muslim land, and consequently every Muslim has this obligation to wage jihad. But still, you're going to have plenty of people who just are not going to play. Now, the problem is that they are always vulnerable to recruitment from the hardliners, because the hardliners can take Quran chapter and verse and the example of Muhammad and the teachings of Islamic law and say, look, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're headed for hell. And there have always been recruits, and probably always will be, who are made on that basis. The percentages thus are very difficult to say, because you have all these Muslims, countless millions of them, who are never going to wage jihad because they don't have the courage, they don't have the will, they prefer to be interested in other things, they're not that religious, whatever. But that could change. They go through a life crisis and they think, I need to get closer to God, and then suddenly they're blowing themselves up. We've seen that in the stories of terrorist after terrorist. Even the 9/11 hijackers, they say they weren't Muslims. They were drinking in a strip club the night before. Well, you know why they were drinking in a strip club the night before? Not because they weren't Muslims, but because they knew they were going to be doing this supreme act of jihad. Somebody came up to Muhammad once, according to an Islamic tradition, and asked him, can you give me a deed that is greater than jihad? And Muhammad said, I do not know of such a deed. So, jihad's the greatest thing a Muslim can do. These guys knew they were going to do this tremendous act of jihad the next day and kill all these infidels. So they kind of had a free pass that night. They could sin however they wanted because they knew that it would all be outweighed by their great act of jihad the next day. So it doesn't mean they were not Muslims. They were very pious. But that's just how Islam works. And so you ask me for a percentage, the problem is that a lot of these Muslims who they might be going to bars and drinking or living with their girlfriends or doing any number of things that are strictly speaking not Islamic, but they really do believe in all this, and maybe one day it will kick in, maybe it won't. And so are they extremists? Are they jihadis? Well, not really, no. They're just the guy that runs the falafel shop or whatever, but maybe that will change one day. Maybe it won't. You never know.
It's really fascinating to me to speak about this idea that's one of these hidden in plain sight type of things of Islamic conquering. The idea of Islam conquering these lands and speaking specifically about Israel, speaking of what we see happening throughout the region and what that means for this. I'd really like to hear your opinion on the open borders in the West. Why?
Yeah, that's just crazy and suicidal.
Right.
When it comes to concepts being hidden in plain sight, I did want to mention that's one of the reasons why the whole October 7th thing was called Al-Aqsa Flood, because they're so enraged at Jews going on to the Temple Mount, even if they're not allowed to pray and they're only there for a few hours every day where the Muslims can come and go and pray as they please. It's an insult to the whole idea of the Temple Mount for Muslims, which is the victory and supremacy of Islam. But nobody seems to understand that, and so it's never discussed in those terms. Anyway,
I'm sorry, I just want to interject that for 100 years, talking about Hajj Amin, al-Husseini, for 100 years, what's been so fantastically jaw-dropping every single day when you open your computer is that the exact same incitement has been working. They have been saying, oh no, the Jews are coming for the Al-Aqsa Mosque for 100 years and inciting people instantly overnight. Certainly there's other libels that go back even further than that, but it's the exact same arguments about Israel. It's the exact same arguments from the Muslim world. And it was also even before that from Crusades and Christianity before that. I just had to say 100 years of
that's because they know that's what's going to really get people fired up, because that strikes at the heart of the whole idea of Islam, which is submission. And the unbelievers are not submitting. They're daring to challenge our hegemony, so they have to be put down. Anyway, the open border, it's madness. There have been hundreds of people on the terror watch list apprehended over the last year. There was a trickle of people on the terror watch list who were apprehended at the border before that. And it skyrocketed when the border got out of control. And that's just the people that were apprehended. We have to understand that for every one that's caught, there are a lot unknown numbers who got through. And where are they? We don't know. What are they going to do? We don't know. But I think that it's quite abundantly clear that it's not just a question of if there will be an attack, but when. And the people are in place here now.
Why do you think that we have implemented such absurd policy, despite all evidence? These are not stupid people. I mean, maybe some of them, but let's be honest. Not all of the politics in here, in the U.S. and in the EU, are all beyond their comprehension what they're letting in. Why?
Yeah, I don't think they're stupid at all. I think they're evil. And what they are, they're Marxists. They're socialist internationalists. And they have taken over the Democrat Party, and they have normalized a kind of soft and stealth Marxism, and they are destroying the United States of America as a nation state. And they want to do that because they're internationalists, and they want to create an international socialist megastate. And an international socialist megastate is against the very idea of something like the United States of America as the world's foremost nation state today. And so if you destroy the world's foremost nation state, the rest of them are going to be easier and will fall into line. So they are opening the border. They're letting in an untold, unknowable number of criminals and terrorists. The idea is to terrorize the native population into submission, and also to dilute the native population so that it doesn't have the voting power it used to have, so that it can be more easily brought into submission. And then once you have this massive mess that you've created with all this chaos and unrest, then you have a very easy justification for clamping down and installing an authoritarian regime that is internationalist and socialist in character. And then we'll unite with other authoritarian regimes elsewhere. And they also hate Israel, of course, because Israel is a state built on particularity. The left is collectivist. Collectivists hate particularity. Think about Mao's China, and everybody wore those little uniforms. Why did everybody wear the same clothes? Because that was equity. That's what Kamala Harris and all the rest of them are promising us, equity. Well, what's equity? If your clothes are nicer than mine, see, we don't have equity. So we wear the same clothes, then we have equity. And you make exactly the same money as I do, equity, no matter what, no matter how smart you are, how industrious you are, and how lazy I am and stupid I am, we still make the same money. That's equity. And so you erase all distinctions between people. That's equity. Then nobody can say that anybody's better than anybody else. And finally, we have justice. It's sort of a perversion of actual justice, but that's the vision. And so here's Israel that is based on the idea of being a Jewish state. Arabs can live there. They have lived there. They have completely equal rights. The apartheid business is a lot of hooey, but it's a Jewish state. So it has to be destroyed because we have to erase all distinctions between people because they get in the way of equity and collectivism. So the left is in charge in the United States. They're busy destroying the United States and installing equity, collectivism, socialism, internationalism, and Israel has to go as well.
And of course, today we have the technology to be able to implement exactly that. We have the ability to, what was only the dream of Hitler and Mao and all of these people back, we can ensure that absolute enforced equality or, authoritarian vision. So translate that thought into what we see out of the Biden administration, what we see from this appeasement, the lack of deterrence. Is that also sort of the taking down of borders type of thing? It's not naivete and thinking we're going to, start roasting marshmallows with the Ayatollah anytime soon. Like really, they don't really believe that. They know.
I don't think it's naivete at all. I think that they're on the side of Hamas. They want Israel to lose this war. And it seems to me unmistakable. What happened right after October 7th? It actually took a little while, but finally Biden made it over to Israel and he stands there with Netanyahu and professes his undying support. And by the way, he says, I'm giving $100 million to Gaza for humanitarian aid. And if that money goes to Hamas, boy, am I going to be mad. Well, who's going to keep it out of the hands of Hamas? Who is he trying to kid? There's no entity in Gaza at that time or now that could possibly stand up to Hamas. If the United States of America knocked on somebody's door and some UN agency or some humanitarian aid group or who knows what in Gaza and handed them the $100 million and left and said, don't give it to Hamas, what happens next? Hamas knocks on the door next. They have all the guns. Where's the $100 million going to go? Now, does Biden not know that? Biden might not know that because Biden ain't there. But the people who run Biden, they know that full well. So the first thing the United States did after all the professions of undying support was support Hamas, give money to Hamas. Even worse, then there was the $10 billion of sanctions relief, the sanctions waiver that the Biden administration approved for Iran. $10 billion for Iran. Who's financing Hamas? Iran. Who's financing Iran? Biden. So the United States of America is funding the war against Israel. And so then they say we're on Israel's side. Okay, so Israel goes into Gaza and fights in Gaza and destroys Hamas almost everywhere. And then there are 4 intact Hamas battalions in Rafah, and that's the last thing. And then it becomes the worst thing in the world. And the Israelis can't go into Rafah. No, you must not go into Rafah. Whatever you do. And I think, oh, come on. What's in Rafah? It makes me wonder because these Biden people, they are evil and they are on the side of Hamas. Obviously, they want to preserve Hamas. They clearly want Israel to fail and Hamas to live. But what else are they afraid the Israelis are going to find? I wouldn't be in the least surprised. I don't know. I don't have any inside information, but I wouldn't be in the least surprised given the people who are in the Biden administration and the nature of the Biden administration, if the Israelis were to discover in Rafah that the Biden administration had been actively financing Hamas and aiding it, maybe even sending it weapons, who knows? I wouldn't be in the least surprised. And that's why they're so nervous about Israel in Rafah.
Well, Israel has always had to lose. Israel's not allowed to win any of its wars. It's interesting to hear your perspective. I mean, either way, they are financing it quite directly.
Yeah.
Everyone knows there's
Yeah,
the
even
fact
if
that
I'm wrong about Rafah, there's no doubt the Biden administration is financing the Hamas war effort. That is beyond dispute. $10 billion to Iran, come on.
and everybody knows that what's such a mistake, as language has lost its meaning, is first of all, people don't even refer to it as a war between Israel and Hamas. It's Israel and Gaza, right? It's Israel's attack on Gaza. But really, it's Israel and Iran. It's just all this semantics, which seems to help people, enjoy their delusions that much longer. And I appreciated the idea of when you talk about Israel being this distinction, and it goes back to this idea that what keeps you from daddy government is God, is family. It's any of these types of things that we see that it has been, actively degraded, or any of those things that sent you to something that's bigger, greater than you. And government is waiting to be its replacement. So
there you go. And so that's why Israel has to be destroyed. And the United States, with the character that it once had as the world's policeman, so-called, or as the shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan said, and as a place where Jews had a situation of freedom, relief from persecution that was unprecedented in human history, and there was peace and coexistence and friendly relations with the Christian majority, and all that is being destroyed. Well, what's going to replace it? An authoritarian government. And so you destroy God, you put the government in place. It's exactly what you were saying.
I felt like if the upheaval, if the chaos that is being, welcomed in, actually, we saw border police snipping away fence in order to let people in. I believe that it's this idea, if you want to talk in sort of biblical terms, right, of Edom or Ishmael, I think that Edom, Rome, if you will, can't imagine Ishmael getting the better of it. And so it feels like I can let you in and sort of do this sort of controlled demolition. But I actually think that's one of this tremendous fallacies, is this idea that they think they'll be able to stop it once it's in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, you look at the leftist alliance with Islam, it's not going to end well for them. Even if they succeed in achieving all their goals, then they're going to turn on each other. And I don't think the left will win. Islam is an older force. It's more deeply rooted among the people. You look, for example, at the Islamic Republic of Iran. When Khomeini overthrew the Shah, the Tudeh party, the leftists in Iran, they were all for it. And they were Khomeini's allies. And they thought he will reward us with a place in his government. And he threw them in prison. And these people think they can ride the tiger now. It's the same thing.
Something that I want to clarify, this idea of the Arab conquering. So the truth is, though, but this land of Israel, so the irony, it's one of these fantastic memes that go around, well, we'll give you this land of milk and honey and fruits the size of basketballs. And we say, what's the catch? And they say, wait till you meet your neighbors. So here we are placed in this land, but it was never an country. There was no cohesive Arab presence or leadership. But what does that mean? That means anything that I want to understand about Israel specifically, but does this mean anywhere that they conquer, that they become more than, once they're the majority that they must conquer? That means that Germany is now Islamic land?
Germany is,
Just about.
yeah, it never was historically. And so it's a different situation. Spain, that I mentioned earlier, Spain was Islamic land. You had the Al-Andalusia, the Caliphate there, the Fatimid Caliphate. That was an Islamic entity. Okay. And so just as Islamic hardliners would say that Israel belongs by right to Islam, so they would also say that Spain does. See, in classic Islam,
it's historical. It's not what they conquer now as they make their moves.
Well, there's both.
Oh, okay.
See, in classic Islamic theology, the world is divided into two parts: the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, the House of War. And so Germany is part of the House of War. It is part of the responsibility of Muslims to always wage war against the House of War in order to diminish it and enlarge the House of Islam. But like Brezhnev said, what we have, we hold. And so any land that was part of the House of Islam at any time is always part of the House of Islam, and it becomes part of the responsibility of the Muslims to drive them out where they drove you out, according to the Quran, chapter 2, verse 191, and consequently to fight to restore that land to the House of Islam. A land can't just go from the House of Islam to the House of War and be left alone. And that's not possible, at least according to the theology. So Israel has to go, Spain has to be Islamized, but also the rest of Europe that was never Islamic has to be incorporated into the House of Islam as well.
So it's very clear. They say it out loud. I've seen countless videos. That's what the thing. You don't have one off the same video you see circulate again. You see very clearly that there's a desire to create a world caliphate. So are we essentially, would you agree that we are sort of pawns in a massive religious war to see a caliphate established, to as well as a war between Sunni and Shiite, a win out of that? Are we just part and parcel to this their great battle?
Yes. In the first place, it's very important to understand that Khalifa means successor, and the traditional understanding is that he's the successor of the Caliph is the successor of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leader of the Muslims. And the Caliph, by right, is the only authority on earth that the Muslims owe allegiance to, not to some president or nation or king, but only to the worldwide ummah, the Islamic community. Now, the last caliphate was the Ottoman Empire, and it fell at the end of World War I. There was a figurehead caliph that was ended on March 3rd, 1924, by the secular Turkish government. So March 3rd, 1924, according to all the jihad groups in the world, including Hamas and all the rest of them, was the beginning of all their troubles. Because before that, the Ummah was united. It wasn't really, but this is the story. The Ummah has been disunited ever since, and under the control of the West, when the West should be submitting to the Muslims, not the other way around. But the West came in and made colonies, excuse me, and established states that were its proxies or its colonies, and Israel is one of those, according to this view. And so the great goal of the jihad groups worldwide is to destroy all these states and reunite the Islamic world as one ummah and restore the caliphate with the caliph as the successor of Muhammad being the sole legitimate ruler. This is part of standard Islamic theology. Now, you mentioned the Sunni Shiite split. This is Sunni Islamic theology. In Shiite Islamic theology, the leader of the Muslim community has to be a member of Muhammad's household. That is a blood relative somehow of Muhammad. Now, that line was extinguished in 874 when the last of the imams of the Shiites was murdered by the Sunnis. And the Shiites believe that boy who was 5 years old at the time he was killed, because this was a hereditary monarchy in the Shiites, since it has to be a blood relative of Muhammad, it was a line that was passed down. And the last one was this 5-year-old boy who was murdered. He is in occultation. He is hiding, but he is alive. And he will return at a time when the Muslims are more persecuted than they ever were before in history. And then he will conquer and Islamize the world in conjunction with Jesus, the Muslim prophet, who will come back and break the cross and destroy Christianity and establish Islamic hegemony all over the world. Now, this is a Shiite idea. This is at variance with the Sunnis, who they believe in the Jesus part, but they don't believe in the 12th Imam part. And so there is likely to be conflict between the two of them over this forever. But they both have these apocalyptic visions of the end of the world, where the fullness of Islamic hegemony over the world will be established. And this also is a threat to Jews, because Muhammad, in a very important statement in Islamic tradition, says that the last day will not come, that this great consummation of all things and the total victory of Islam will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And the Jews will hide behind trees, and the trees will cry out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." Except for the Garkad tree, which is the tree of the Jews. And there are actually Islamic clerics today who say, you see the Israelis, they're planting Garkad trees all over Israel, because they're waiting for the end, as if the Israelis believe this. And the idea, though, is it's not just an apocalyptic vision. Remember, it says the last hour will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So if Muslims want to bring about the total victory of Islam and the final Islamization of the world, they kill Jews to do it.
So Christians get a pass because they can convert and Jesus comes back, but Moses doesn't come back.
No, Jesus is going to come back. It's a very curious thing in Islamic theology.
Never heard this, yeah.
Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet, but it's Jesus who comes back at the end of the world. And there are a lot of reasons for that we can get into, but they're a bit tangential for our discussion today. But it's not that Christians get a pass, because this is not Jesus of Christianity. This is Jesus, the Muslim prophet.
Jesus.
And what he will do when he comes back is he will break the cross, kill the pig, and abolish the jizya. Now, those three things have to do with Christianity. Break the cross is because the Quran says in chapter 4, verse 157, that the Jews say, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary. But this is a saying among them. They do not know for certain. They did not kill or crucify him, but it appeared so to them. So in other words, the Jews are running around, this is in the Quran, the Jews are running around boasting that they killed Jesus, but they did not actually do so. They did not crucify him. He did not die on a cross at all. So the Christians, when they have their crosses, that is an insult to Allah, because Allah would not allow one of his prophets to suffer such a humiliation. And so Jesus, when he comes back, is going to break all the crosses, which means destroy Christianity. Kill the pig, because the Christians say this is the Messiah who freed us and we don't have to obey the laws that were in place previously. So they don't have food laws. So the Muslims have the food laws. The pork is going to all be killed, because all this is over now, and this false religion of Christianity is going to be destroyed. And abolish the jizya. The jizya is the tax specified in chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran, that the people of the book, that is the Jews and the Christians, must pay. to the Muslims as a sign of their submission. And historically, in the Islamic empires, the Jews and Christians always paid this tax that the Muslims don't have to pay. They were actually the economic base for the great Islamic empires. When the Jewish and Christian communities were impoverished by having to pay this tax over the centuries, then those empires went into decline. That's why the Ottoman Empire went into decline and ultimately fell, because it stopped conquering new lands and it bled dry the Jews and Christians in the lands it had conquered, didn't have any more economic base. But anyway, Jesus, when he comes back, will abolish the jizya. That is, that intermediate state that the Jews and Christians can be in now, but not at the end of the world. The idea is you have to either convert to Islam or submit and pay the jizya or be killed. Jesus, when he comes back, he's going to abolish the jizya, which means you have to either convert or be killed. So then all the Christians will either convert to Islam or be killed. The Jews will be killed, except the ones that are behind the Garkad trees. And the whole world will be Islamic.
It's absolutely fascinating. A bit of a turn, and something that obviously troubles me deeply, and everyone who was in Israel. Certainly, we live what I affectionately call a kind of Frogger existence, right? You go out to the store, you get on the road, you just don't get any guarantees. None of us do, but you get that a lesson up close. So there's certainly been, I know you know very well, the Fogel case. There have been isolated, as it were, incidences throughout history of horrifically brutal attacks. So October 7th made it impossible to see those as isolated incidents or as anything except exactly what it was. And what I want to speak about is what's so unusual about that is the barbarity, but the jubilance, the exhilaration with which it happens, because we talked about our shared humanity, and certainly as Americans, as people of democratic countries, we're mostly live and let live. Maybe you annoy me a little more, you a little less, but we kind of want to get on with it. Can you explain that to me? That level of, I said this recently. John Spencer noticed, has taken many people into battle, many soldiers into battle. No one's jubilant. No one goes in without fear, without an ounce of fear. Videotaping and calling home to dad. So, your thoughts on that?
How could they do that?
I guess I'm curious about, here we are, all humans, and I guess I want to understand more the personalness of it, the savagery, the absolute horrific tearing apart, the taking home pieces of bodies as a souvenir, the jubilance of making that happen. That's a religious fervor. I don't know. Could we compare that to the Crusades? I don't know.
Oh, it's much worse.
Far worse.
See, you talk about our shared humanity. And that's a Jewish idea, that's a Christian idea, but it's not an Islamic idea. I've mentioned these passages before, but let me emphasize them. Chapter 3, verse 110 of the Quran, you are the best of people on the earth, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. The corollary, chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran, the unbelievers among the people of the book are the most vile of created beings. Chapter 8, verse 55 of the Quran, the unbelievers are like animals. Chapter 7, verse 179, they're like cattle. No, they're worse, because the cattle are ignorant. So, you've got the best of people on earth. You've got the most vile of created beings who are animalistic, who are like animals. So there's no passage in the Quran that says, hey, we're all children of Abraham here, or We're all children of Adam, for that matter. Adam was another Muslim prophet, and they all taught Islam. And then there are these animalistic renegades who twisted the teachings of Islam to create these fake religions. They deserve no respect. They deserve no human consideration. And to drive the point home, chapter 48, verse 29 of the Quran, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers, merciful to one another. Now, this is the word of Allah. This is not even Muhammad speaking. This is, excuse me, the creator of the stars and the galaxies speaking. This is the fashioner of everything that is imaginable speaking. And so this is not our common humanity or our shared human nature. There's no idea of that. These people are evil. They are enemies of Allah. They are animals. And so what do? You kill them and you rejoice. Because not only that, there's a very telling passage. Chapter 9, verse 14 and 15 of the Quran. Fight them, and Allah will punish them by your hands and soothe the bosoms of the believers. So, what do you get from this passage? You have to fight the unbelievers, and insofar as you do so, Allah is going to be executing his divine wrath through you. So, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. There's no concept of that in Islam. In Islam, fight them and Allah will punish them by your hands. So when they came out of Gaza on October 7th and murdered all the Israelis, they were the wrath of Allah. They were executing the wrath of Allah on the most vile of created beings. So who wouldn't rejoice when you're doing such a holy act? And it will soothe the bosoms of the believers. So if you're troubled, if you are depressed about your life situation, but you go and you kill an unbeliever, then you can feel satisfaction in your heart because you're pleasing Allah. And so rejoice. This is the time to be happy.
So that goes in line certainly with the mass rape, the humiliation. That I can conceptualize.
There's more for the mass rape as well. But yes, the idea is that the unbelievers need to be humiliated and shown that they must submit. Definitely. But also, chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran says that you can marry up to 4 women and the captives of the right hand. Now, who are the captives of the right hand? Chapter 4, verse 24 gives you very precise instructions as to who you may have sexual relations with and who you may not. And so it says you're forbidden to you are your mother and your sister, etc., etc., but not the captives of the right hand. And chapter 33, verse 50 says they are the spoils of war. Chapter 23, verse 1 to 6 says that the righteous man guards his private part except with his wives and the captives of the right hand. And so this is one of the things that's specified in the Quran, that it is permissible to take women who are non-Muslims as spoils of war and to rape them, to use them sexually. They are permitted to you. And in doing so, you are pleasing Allah because you are, as you noted, humiliating them and showing them that they are the most vile of created beings and that you are the best of people.
So GoProing the most horrific crimes against humanity, your opinion on why to publicize it to the world?
Because this is, from an Islamic standpoint, these are holy, sacred acts. These are not heinous crimes. These are acts of service to Allah, as I have explained. So you take, for example, an analogy to the rapes. In England, for decades now, there have been Pakistani rape gangs operating in England with impunity. And the British authorities have been cravenly, cowardly, afraid to apprehend them for fear of being called racist and Islamophobic, because they were all Pakistani men and Muslims. A lot of people have noted that they were Pakistanis as if there was something intrinsic about their being Pakistani, but that actually is just a consequence of the fact that it's a large number of Pakistanis immigrating to England. The real situation was that they were Muslims, and they were considering these girls to be the captives of the right hand. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is this. These people didn't feel ashamed of this. You look at the composition of the rape gangs, and a lot of times it's father and son, or a bunch of brothers and their cousins. And they would all get the family men to join in. And nobody thought, oh, this is a shameful thing to do. This is terrible. Because in Islam, this is what you do to the spoils of war, the captives of the right hand. And so you are pleasing Allah when you fulfill his commands. And so nobody thought twice about it. And they said, hey, Uncle Ahmed, come on and join in. It's a party. And it's something that pleases Allah.
Something that I find confusing. I can understand the GoProing of sort of, letting that smell of blood flood the Islamic world. But it's the little children that I can't wrap my head around, because say I see a puppy or a calf, say I think, I'm thinking these people as animals. There's a very human experience of reacting to the vulnerable, and the vulnerable are targeted. I can't wrap my head around it.
If you have divine writ telling you these people are not vulnerable, these people are the enemies of Allah. These people are the most intense in hostility toward the best of people. These people are vile. They are animals. Then this is all priming you to try to override your natural tendency to feel compassion for the vulnerable.
It's incredible.
Why you see mothers, all over in Judea and Samaria, as well as in Gaza. And they say, my son, Muhammad, he murdered 6 Jews and he was martyred. And I'm so happy he's in paradise with Allah. Overriding the natural maternal instinct and saying, I'm glad my son is dead. But this is because she's doing as was instructed, as has been drilled into her from birth, that this is what is great in Islam. There's a saying that is very common among jihad terrorists, and it is, we love death more than you love life. I see jihadis repeat this all the time. Palestinians as well as others all around the world. The Boston Marathon bombers said it. And it's all over the place. And it comes from chapter 62, verse 6 of the Quran, which is actually directed to the Jews. It says, the Jews say that we are God's chosen and his beloved. Let them show they love death if they're telling the truth. Because see, if you're really the chosen of Allah, then you'll want to be with Allah and not be on earth. And so you'll love death.
Wow. So that is the explanation why we basically face a death cult. That's entirely clear. So you can only be close to Allah then once you're dead. So you have to abide by Islam in order to actually even get there.
Yeah.
At any point.
Also,
Okay.
There's another thing I neglected to mention, and that is being horny. That you have young boys, and you have a culture where, of course, there's strict separation of the sexes. So you have young boys, and they hear they're going to go to paradise, and what's in paradise? But the virgins of paradise, they're real. It's not. It's a lot of people in the West, they think this must be a gag. This is crazy, but it's in the Quran that there are these beautiful women who are going to attend the blessed in paradise. Nothing is said about what paradise is like for the women. It says the women will go to paradise if they're righteous, but it doesn't say what it's like. But for men, they get these girls. And there are couches, and you recline on the couches, and you enjoy sumptuous food, and there's rivers of wine flowing through, and you have these virgins. And so a lot of these young boys growing up in this culture where they can't even get close to a female, there was actually a kid, I remember this some years ago, who was stopped at an Israeli checkpoint, and they sent out one of those machines, that disarm somebody wearing a bomb vest. It's a very sophisticated machine that the IDF has. And he's standing there stripped to his shorts because the bomb vest is being deactivated, and surrounded at a great distance by soldiers and everything at this checkpoint. And he calls out, "How am I going to get to paradise now and get the virgins?" And he's taking this with utmost seriousness. And so that's another thing. But also we have to understand that if sex is the highest good that the blessed in paradise enjoy, then it also lends an aspect to it on earth, that the best way to humiliate and destroy your enemy is to destroy them sexually. So you rape them.
It brings me back full circle to the idea that you said that there's no in between. You're either a sinner or you're a good Muslim. This is an idea that has frustrated me so much in what I see, certainly by the Islamic Republic, and that the lack of accountability, zero accountability. There is only you are bad, the infidel, the Jew, the women, every single entity in the world is a problem and a pitfall for the good Muslim, but there is zero lack of self-reflection or accountability. That just seems to be this rudimentary part that's missing from the religion. Where is the self-reflection? Where is there any sense of progress, of betterment?
There is no progress or betterment, but there is self-reflection and accountability. It's just not what you would expect. It's all based on divine revelation. So, for example, if you want to spot an Islamic hardliner, look at the cuffs of his trousers. And if they are very high, then you know you're dealing with somebody who's dangerous. Why? Because there's a tradition in which Muhammad says that he who lets the hem of his garment trail on the ground, it is trailing in hellfire. Why? I don't know. That's just one of those nutty things, of which there are many in Islamic tradition. But that's why you will see these Salafis, and they have these Michael Jackson pants with the cuffs up at the ankles. And this is accountability. They are taking account of what Muhammad said and acting accordingly. The problem is when you see a guy like that, you know that he takes all of it very seriously. And that means he takes jihad very seriously as well. And so watch what you do and say around him and watch what he does. But there is a great sense of accountability in the sense of, yes, I could end up in hellfire if I don't scrupulously observe all the tenets of the religion. But that doesn't extend to some idea of accountability to humanity as a force or as an entity at all. There is only the Ummah.
If you were able to help make the decisions how to keep Israel safe and secure, what would be your recommendation?
Israel has to be strong, has to be much stronger than the jihad force in the first place. Because actually Islamic law stipulates you should not wage jihad if you have no chance of winning. And that's why, people say this jihad that we're seeing in the world today, it's a new thing. It's not in Islam, really, because in the 1950s or 60s, we didn't see people blowing themselves up or flying planes into buildings. Yeah, that's true. But that was because the West was so much stronger then and is weak now. And so they think they can win. That's actually one of the foremost points that Osama bin Laden makes in his declaration of jihad against America, that it's really not as strong as it seems. And Allah will grant victory to the righteous because, as I noted way back, there's a one-to-one equation between righteousness and victory on this earth. Anyway, Israel, if it's so strong that it doesn't look as if there's any prospect of victory, then they should not fight according to Islamic theology. Israel needs to pay attention to Islamic theology. Muhammad said war is deceit and allowed for lying in wartime. That's one of the only conditions, one of the handful of conditions in which lying is allowed. And so Hamas, on October 8th, there was a Hamas official on Russian television boasting about how they had told the Israelis that for 2 years, as they plotted the October 7th attack, they told the Israelis they were more interested in governing Gaza than in waging jihad. And the Israelis believed them and left the border vulnerable. Why did they believe them? They should put war is deceit on the wall of every office in the IDF headquarters and study what that means and study what Islamic treaty making is. That the Treaty of Hudaybiyah is the foundation for all Islamic treaty making, and it only allows for treaties with non-Muslims on the basis of the Islamic side is losing and needs to buy time to fight again more effectively. So when Hamas says, hey, we want a truce, Hamas is telling you we're losing and we need time to gather strength. Now, of course, Biden is interfering now because he's the biggest Hamas booster. But there have been so many times over the years that I've seen Hamas asks for a truce and the Israelis say, yeah, okay. No, that's when they should have pressed all the harder. And there's so many things in Islam that if they understood Islam, they would not behave the way they do. Another thing is the very concept of the Palestinians. The Palestinians do not exist. They were invented in 1964. Before that, there were no Palestinians. You look at 1947 and 48, and all the UN deliberations over the founding of Israel and the partition, nobody mentions Palestinians. They didn't exist. They were the local Arabs. They are not different culturally, linguistically, ethnically, or religiously from the Arabs of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Menachem Begin was pressured by Jimmy Carter and Anwar Sadat to accept at the Camp David Accords the existence of the Palestinians as a distinct people. And now it's been taken for granted. The Israeli government needs to roll that back and say there are no Palestinians. We're dealing with Arabs, and pressure the Syrians and the Lebanese and the Jordanians to end their hypocrisy and allow citizenship for those people because they're the same in those neighboring countries. And then if this had been a sane situation without Islamic theology, then when the Arab Higher Committee told the Arabs to leave Israel in 1948, they would have been allowed citizenship in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and there never would have been a problem. But the Syrians, Lebanese, and Jordanians did actually for a while. But if the neighboring countries had allowed the Palestinian Arabs citizenship, there never would have been a problem. They did not, because they wanted to use them to destroy Israel. The KGB and Yasser Arafat invented the Palestinians in 1964 as a rhetorical trick, and it's the biggest propaganda deceit in the history of the world and the most successful one.
Absolutely.
The idea was, in the 1960s, everybody loved Israel because Israel was the underdog facing 22 Arab states that hated it, that were massively larger than it, and it kept beating them. And people like that kind of story. The David versus Goliath, the plucky underdog winning against rapacious and evil, huge enemies. So the KGB, they were masters of propaganda. They invented the Palestinians and even smaller people facing the mighty IDF. And they have put that lie over all the world. Israel needs to repudiate it and stop taking for granted that the Palestinians even exist as such or deserve a state as a distinct ethnicity and nationality when they aren't. And there are 22 Arab states. Why do we have to have a 23rd? And then they're going to want a 24th in what's left of Israel. Because of the jihad imperative that nobody wants to acknowledge.
Right.
And, years ago, I was talking to Barry Rubin, and I said, nobody seems interested in talking about Islam in Israel. He said, that's because they all know it. That's because they're all aware of what they're dealing with. And I thought, actually, it's just the opposite. I think Israel has no idea about what Islam teaches or why this situation keeps on being so intractable. And the key is all in Islam, and they don't want to face it. They have to face it.
I think that that's completely true. Both the fact that, well, the very existence of this Palestine. And first of all, there was quite a few refugees in around 1945. People will remember quite a few Jewish, German. So there's nothing special. They're the only people in the entire world who get 80 years of refugee status.
And it passed down from the children,
yeah, right.
children's children. And I mean, that's ridiculous. You know, my grandparents were exiled from the Ottoman Empire. So if I were Palestinian, I'd be a refugee, even though I was born in the United States and my parents were born in the United States. It's ridiculous. But the grandchildren of people who were in the area that is now Israel and have never been there and were born in Michigan or wherever, they're Palestinian refugees, according to the UN. It's an absurd situation that is just yet another weapon to use against Israel.
Well, it's twofold, because let's be clear, Gaza and Yehud and Shomron, the West Bank, that's in Israel. So when they say we want to return, they mean we want all the Jews to go or be removed so that we can return to the rest of Israel. They are in Israel right now, this land that they love so much. And the whole idea of the Gazan civilians being the battleground itself, that's true. That's been true always. They were kept as if 22 Arab nations couldn't have absorbed them 15 times over, as if they couldn't have had a state of their own, as if this had anything to do about any of the things that people pretend in the media does. Their existence and their very real suffering is 100% to be a constant finger of accusation against Israel. What do we do with this information? How do we address it? How do we face it?
Well, I wish I had an answer to that. I mean, I was just saying, I don't think that Israelis are really aware of these things. And I look at the Netanyahu government and I think, well, it's certainly better than the alternatives, but he doesn't seem to have any clearer understanding of this than anybody else. And then I see people say the far right government and all these things because he's a little more aware of these realities than other people. But the fact is, as you noted, Gaza and what is called the West Bank, they're not only are they historically part of the land of Israel, but legally, excuse me, according to international law, they're part of the land that was set aside by the League of Nations and then affirmed by the United Nations to be the Jewish national home. So there really isn't any other country that can claim that it owns this land. And so it's supposed to be occupied territory. Who occupied by whom? From whom? And there's so much disinformation and misinformation around there. I suppose the only answer I can give you around these issues, the only answer I can give you to your question of what can be done is to keep on telling the truth and reminding people of these things, or alerting people to these facts, to try to bring about political change in Israel and the United States that might ease the pressure on Israel to some degree.
I think that's entirely true. And the fact that Israelis, while there might be some, again, like we talked about, those sort of, as it were, isolated cases, and then the massive invasion that happened October 7th made it undeniable to us anymore. So I think that it was very important for us to understand better the nature of what we face, but ultimately, whatever negligence happened over the 2 years that they were planning, and you want to believe it's so, again, different on an elemental level, this way of thinking, that again, so many people who are happy to either agree, disagree, or just never see each other again so they can move on with their lives and progress and go on vacation now and then. It's so foreign. It really, actually, you have to keep on reminding yourself of it. It's very hard to keep in your head that this is what we're dealing with. Of course, now we have absolutely no other option. So I am just, you have given me so much food for thought. I hope you'll come on again. And there's so much to learn. And I think that that's, again, I am a deep believer in speaking the truth, and I'm a believer of being in constant learning. And so please come back and teach us more. And of course, find you at Jihad Watch. Tell us where to find all of your books, all of your writings.
Yeah, I am at jihadwatch.org, and that is the world's only news site dedicated to giving you news about jihad activity in all its forms around the world, the war against Israel and elsewhere. And that's at jihadwatch.org. I have 28 books that you can find at Amazon and at Barnes & Noble and anywhere that books are sold, or at least you can ask them for it. The book that I have there on the screen, The Palestinian Delusion, is subtitled The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process, and it is a fuller explanation of many of the points that I have made today, so people might be interested in picking up that one in particular.
I was going to ask you that. What are the top three that will help us have a better understanding of this period of time?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's certainly The Palestinian Delusion, and I have another book that I mentioned earlier, The History of Jihad, which takes jihad activity from the time of the origins of Islam all the way up to the present, and also has, of course, a great deal to do with Israel in the later chapters, because Israel is yet another jihad, although it is not very often identified as such. And people may be interested in books about the basic ideology of Islam. I suppose the best one, the fullest one, is The Critical Quran, which is a clear translation of the Quran plus commentary to show you how these passages are understood in mainstream Islam. And so it also discusses Israel here and there and shows what the Quran actually teaches about the Jews as well as everything else, and shows the well springs of the tremendous hostility that we see from the Islamic world toward Jews today.
Okay, we're on it. Lots to learn. Hopefully you'll come on again, and I wish you only well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.